This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This is going to be my first ever live full solo episode. And by live, I mean not streamed to YouTube, but I'm recording it ahead of time and I'm going to be on video. When I do solo episodes like the one that I did last week on NT Wright, I did release a little bumper trailer or whatever for that on YouTube because we're going to have some video content out there. But I try to cut and edit a lot of the work that I do because I want to make sure that it is very polished and that I'm doing a very good job of communicating the ideas that I'm trying to get across to my audience. And with an episode like last week where there are audio clips, I honestly have no idea how to use software like this and display them while I'm talking. So this year, one of my goals is to learn how to use StreamYard a little bit better because LCI wants us to be doing more video content. But the story behind the episode today, which is going to be more of a freewheeling episode, which is why I figured I might as well try doing a long form episode on video, is that I had an interview fall through for good reasons, very good reasons. It wasn't bad or anything, but I had the interview fall through and I needed to get some content out. And there's been a lot that I've been working on and reflecting on outside of the show lately that I wanted to address in this episode. So I really am hoping that I can make this one a little bit shorter. And if you're one of those people that enjoy watching the videos, well, congratulations. Here I am. This is what I look like after working for 8 hours. So this is where we're at. I also want to apologize if it's a little bit rougher than normal. I really just kind of jotted down some ideas over the last couple of days, some things that I really wanted to discuss. So it might not be as clean as it normally is. But here we are. We're going to try this, do something different, and I hope that you guys enjoy this. So there are several things that I wanted to talk about on the show today, but in reality, it's all related to one big theme. And we did this episode last week where I looked at NT Wright, and it was the third in my series called Ludwig von Mises versus a Christian Scholar, where I look at the way that Christian biblical scholars use language about economics and just demonstrate that when you actually have comprehensive definitions of very important economic terms, you can see that there are some major problems in these New Testament scholars' interpretations of the text and then in the conclusions that they draw from them. And I want to be as specific as possible about the language that we use to describe politics and economics in the New Testament, because obviously I believe that the Bible is authoritative. And I believe that we have a responsibility as Christians to say things about Scripture that are consistent with what it actually teaches, instead of the danger which we all face of just importing all of our own ideas into these ancient texts and seeing nothing but a reflection of ourselves. And one of the things that, as I've discussed on the show before, that really pushed me into libertarianism is that when I was in college in the late 2000s, this was when the kind of anti-imperial reading of the New Testament was becoming very popular. So there were scholars that were releasing a lot of literature on Jesus and empire and on Paul and empire. And I was listening to a lot of podcasts and reading a lot of books at this time. Back then, it wasn't even podcasts. Back then, it was iTunes U. And I had an iPod and I had to get online when I had Wi-Fi and download episodes individually. It was very, very wild times back then. A lot different and more difficult to find information than it was today. But I did a lot of reflecting on that. And it was obvious to me because in my biblical studies training, we had been taught to try to put our modern biases to the side when we're interpreting the New Testament. And it seemed like all of these scholars who were making these very sweeping statements about politics and economics were taking their own modern conceptions about politics and their own modern political ideologies and interpreting the New Testament through the framework of those ideologies. And it was pretty easy to see, especially if you read carefully, like the preface of a lot of these books or the conclusions of a lot of these books, that these authors had a political bend. And even though they were doing very careful scholarship in some respects, they were obviously trying to draw conclusions about Jesus that were congenial to their own political positions. And the grand irony of these anti-imperial readings of the New Testament is that they almost always wind up making Jesus and Paul left-leaning figures. And there's another great irony that comes along with that. Many of these scholars that have produced leftist readings of the New Testament are very critical when American conservative evangelicals read their own conservative cultural and political biases back into the text. But then they do the exact same thing on the left. And as I got older and started studying economics and thinking about what these economics terms actually mean, I realized that some of the most fundamental language, like the word capitalism and the word socialism, were being used in ways that were just wildly inconsistent and that had no stable or concrete definition. And it's very easy, especially in left-wing biblical scholarship, to see how the word capitalism literally just means some sort of political policy that I don't like. Now, of course, there's the idea that's always lurking in the background of all modern scholarship. And I did an episode on Friedrich Hayek's book, The Counter-Revolution of Science, about a year and a half ago, where Friedrich Hayek outlines how the idea that all of human society can be centrally planned is based on a set of Enlightenment assumptions about human nature that just aren't true, but that the idea that we need to have technocrats in charge of all society has more or less been the dominant paradigm for thinking about politics since the beginning of the 19th century. And regardless of whether one is a progressive or a conservative in the modern world, the idea of a technocratic state is ubiquitous. Everyone more or less believes that we need to have a centrally planned economy, and capitalism is seen as the antithesis of that, which, if you have an anchored definition of the term capitalism, it is, but a lot of people don't understand what that word means or use it in any sort of accurate way. And as we're going to see, because I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a few minutes of prominent biblical scholars that I think have dramatically misunderstood capitalism, once you grasp that capitalism and socialism have like a real concrete definition, then it makes it very easy to see how people have appropriated this language to refer to either that which they don't like, and they usually use the word capitalism to describe that, and that which they do like, which is where the word socialism derives most of its meaning. There's very, very unclear. And I want to give a couple of examples of this today because I've been thinking about this. And one of the big things that I've done on my show over the last couple of years is that I've tried to provide a definition of capitalism and socialism that is clear, concise, and irreducible. That means that you have to have a definition of these terms that somebody can't say, well, in this particular instance, this doesn't count as either capitalism or socialism for subjective reasons. And I go back to my Econ 101 textbook fairly often, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this on last week's show, where the textbook just defined capitalism as a system of private ownership of resources and decentralized economic decision-making, and socialism is its exact opposite, that it is a system where the resources are publicly owned and all of these economic decisions are made from some sort of central planning committee or by a quote unquote democratic process or something along those lines. And that I've always thought was a very good fundamental starting point for thinking about capitalism and socialism. And of course, I'm an adherent to the Austrian school of economics. And so capitalism really starts with property rights. Every single human being owns their own body. Therefore, they own their own labor. And as long as capital, the things that you use to produce goods and services, are acquired either through original appropriation or through contractual exchange. In other words, if all of the capital that one accumulates is done in a moral way that doesn't impinge upon somebody else's liberty and that doesn't impinge upon somebody else's property, then within a system like that, there can be no exploitation. And what really matters in capitalism is the idea that all transactions are voluntary and that the private property rights of all individuals are upheld. That is like the fundamental definition of capitalism within the Austrian school, that capital, the factors of production, are privately controlled, but they're controlled in a way that respects the property rights of other people. And these economic decisions are made by the capitalists. They're made by the people that actually own the capital instead of by some central planning committee. And one of the problems with socialism always will be is that you can say, as Marx does, that in the communist utopia, there will be no ownerships of goods. But in the real world, the people that make the decisions about how resources are utilized, about which factors of production to invest in, and about what goods and services to produce are the people that own the capital, right? These are the people that own the resources and control the economy. And you can't get away from that in socialism. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the Austrian school of economics is how clearly they see both of these terms. You either have laissez-faire free market capitalism, which is a system in which capital is owned privately and decisions about how that capital is utilized are made privately, or you have socialism where there's intervention from the outside, that people that did not originally appropriate the capital or that didn't acquire it through contractual means has a right to tell those that did acquire that morally what to do with their property, which I believe is always morally wrong. But when you start with those two definitions of capitalism instead of, socialism is basically government control, and that's a good thing because we need controls, and capitalism is uncontrolled, and we have to have some sort of control, so capitalism is automatically bad. Well, you're going to wind up with some pretty poor conclusions. You're going to come to some conclusions that just don't make a whole lot of sense. Whereas if you have an anchor definition, a very clear, consistent, irreducible definition, such as, capitalism is just the private ownership of capital and private decision-making about that capital, and socialism is the opposite of that. It's when you don't have the ability to make decisions about the capital that you have rightfully and peacefully acquired. That helps us to reframe how we better understand these terms. And most biblical scholars have done a terrible job of trying to define what capitalism and socialism actually mean. And I think that some of this has to do with the fact that there are many academics, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, that have been steeped in critical theory, which purports to have its roots in Marxism, but actually deviates from some very important fundamental Marxist ideas. And I'm not the right person to talk to you about this. I had a really cool interview with the Marxist Noah Kratchvik a while ago, and I'll put links to that in the show notes. And Noah was explaining to me the difference between like orthodox Marxism and its derivations. And I just believe that there are a lot of these biblical scholars that have kind of like half digested some of these Marxist ideas through the lens of critical theory and then taken them and applied them to the text. And we've talked a lot on the show about Albert Schweitzer and Henry Cadbury, two New Testament scholars from the early 20th century who wrote these really incredible books where they kind of explored the phenomenon of how New Testament scholars and writers about the historical Jesus always inevitably wind up making him in their own image. I mean, Henry Cadbury's book was titled The Peril of Modernizing Jesus, that we want Jesus to be a modern man because we want Jesus to be able to answer all of our modern questions. And honestly, even if it's implicit, who wouldn't want Jesus on their side? Or if you think that Jesus was a terrible person, then your interpretation of the Bible is going to make him out to be a bad person so that you can marginalize him. But either way, every intellectual living in the Western world, or everyone, I wouldn't consider myself an intellectual, but everyone that thinks about these ideas seriously that's living in the Western world, I think at some point has to come to the realization that Jesus is an important figure, that he had a massive impact on human history, and people tend to interpret Jesus in a way that makes him congenial to our own world and often makes Jesus out to be someone who would affirm all of our social and cultural and political biases. And so you have fundamentalist evangelicals who have constructed the MAGA Jesus, for example, and you have a lot of progressive or liberal Christians who make Jesus out to be some progressive, and then they often apply the term socialist to Jesus. And I just don't think that this works for a number of reasons. Now, I am of the opinion that Christians, once we have an anchored definition of capitalism and socialism, like the one I proposed in this show, we should be able to have good faith conversations about which ones we think, or about which of those two definitions we believe is most consistent with our theological values and most consistent with the reading of the Bible. And I've come to the conclusion that capitalism is far and away more consistent with the values that are embedded in the New Testament. I think we should be able to have good faith conversations about that. I also think that we have to realize that the writers of the New Testament are not trying to give us any sort of macroeconomic theory. The New Testament is not an economics handbook. And there is a lot of really great material in the New Testament because the New Testament is culturally embedded and it's embedded in the political and economic world of the first century. And so there are a ton of texts in the New Testament that deal with these social and political and economic realities. And we have to interpret these texts and we have to try to draw principles from these texts as Christians that we can apply to the modern world. So the idea that we would interpret the Bible looking for principles that we can then take to help us think about how we need to engage in our complex modern world is an absolutely worthwhile endeavor. But I think that if we believe that the Bible necessarily teaches in all of its facets, capitalism or socialism, then we're just reading our modern political context back into Scripture. The reality is that socialism and capitalism are economic terms that have been used in a lot of conflicting and contradictory ways, but they're essentially developed in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. So these are terms that are designed to apply to modern economic and political arrangements. And in the ancient world, yes, they have an economy, obviously, and they have a politic. That's for sure. They have politics. That's for sure. But they didn't think about economics and politics in the same way that we did. And to assume that when we pull certain statements out of the Bible, that they will automatically, neatly fall into the category of capitalism or socialism is just creating from the start a historical mistake. The Bible's not really designed to give us that kind of information. Now, I do think that the Bible can give us principles that will help us think about how we work through our understanding of contemporary economics. And I do believe that when we take the Bible seriously, there is a lot to work with there. But we have to understand that we can't just go back to the text and assume that Jesus is picking one side or the other, because I don't think that he is, because I don't think that that's what his teaching was designed to do. The other point that I want to make about biblical scholarship, and then I want to look at one passage in the New Testament and then a couple of New Testament scholars that have dealt with this issue in, I think, a very uncritical way, is that I really, truly, deeply and sincerely believe that we have to deal with these economic issues, and that we have to come up with constructive ways of talking about them. But we just make the mistake often, very often, of trying to get information out of the Bible that just doesn't. It wasn't designed to give us. That's the point that I'm trying to make here, as simply as possible, and we just have to be very careful about the terminology that we use to understand these texts. And since people have been so careless and so uncritical about applying modern economic terms to ancient texts that maybe aren't necessarily dealing with the economic worldview of modern Western thinkers, we've made a lot of mistakes in our interpretation. I think a really good example of this, and I'm pulling one out of the New Testament. This episode is probably going to be called Jesus and Capitalism, because I'm giving you my thoughts about the relationship between these two. But there's a really great text here that demonstrates what I'm trying to get at. And this is from Luke chapter 12. And this is what Jesus says. So this is from Luke chapter 12, and this is starting in verse, which ones am I looking at here? All right, Luke chapter 12, this is starting in verse 13 of chapter 12. He says, "Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?' Then he said to them, 'Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build my larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God.'" So Jesus is asked to arbitrate these two brothers over the inheritance. And immediately immediately we're going to see that there's a historical problem here, because the question that should naturally follow from the opening verse of this passage is, well, why are these two brothers arguing over the inheritance? What did an inheritance look like in the context of first century Galilee or Judea? And why would somebody want a third party to intervene in this dispute? These are all historical questions that theoretically we could, through careful historical analysis, answer. But we can't just assume that these brothers have the same mindset and the same framework about inheritance as we do. And we can't assume that inheritance works the same way in the ancient world as it does in the modern world. And a lot of people would look at a passage like this and not even ask those very basic historical questions. Now, I gotta give left-wing biblical scholars credit. I do think that there's a problem among conservative biblical scholars, especially confessional biblical scholars, and that all of their interpretations of the New Testament have to result in their confessional theology being correct. So they're already starting out with a certain set of theological principles, and their interpretation of the Bible has to lead directly to those theological principles. The great thing about the more freeing thing about left-leaning biblical scholars is that a lot of them, believe me, they're still very heavily invested in certain theological conclusions. There's no way around that. But they're more open in general, at least in my experience, towards analyzing the text in its historical context and trying to understand how these would have worked in an ancient economy. Now, don't get me wrong. There are I think that Bruce Winter is kind of a conservative. I think that Peter Oakes is kind of a conservative. Kenneth Bailey's another one who's done a lot of this social scientific research, who I think is kind of conservative. But there are a lot more scholars that tend to be a little bit more theologically liberal that are doing this kind of economic work. And I've actually learned a lot from their research, because they bring up a lot of good primary source, either it's documentary or archaeological evidence about how first century economic life worked. And so they have these really incredible insights, historical insights about the economy of the first and second century and about the political realities of the first and second centuries. You have to be aware, though, that when they come to applying those insights to Jesus, they almost always wind up making Jesus out to be some sort of a leftist. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that they have just a fundamental misunderstanding of capitalism or socialism. And so moving forward, even in a couple minutes here, when I get into these two biblical scholars that I want to talk about, that I want to talk about briefly towards the end of the show, we're going to see that they do a lot of great research that's had a really big impact on my life, but they just they draw a lot of wrong conclusions from that very good research. But within this passage here, again, we'd have to understand how inheritance works. We would have to understand why these two brothers would be in conflict over the inheritance. And then as Jesus tells this parable, we would have to say, well, why does the person that owns this farm tear down his silos and build larger ones? What does it mean sociologically to hoard all of this stuff up in a silo? How would this have been heard by probably a mostly rural and peasant audience in the first century? We can't simply assume that this neatly corresponds to our modern social and political sensibilities. And the problem with a passage like this is that, left-leaning Christians would say, well, look, this obviously teaches socialism because this guy was being greedy and hoarding his possessions. And socialism is all about being good and about being charitable and about sharing. And capitalism is all about greed. So clearly this is a passage that is a condemnation of capitalism and an affirmation of socialism. But once you take all the unnecessary moralizing out of the definition of capitalism and socialism and ask yourself the question, does this passage have anything to do with who owns and makes decisions about capital? Or on the flip side, because it does actually kind of deal a little bit with capital acquisition and capital and the management of capital. But on the flip side, Jesus isn't saying that because this guy was being greedy by hoarding all of his resources to himself, that therefore the government should come in, take it all from him and redistribute it to people that they see fit while enriching themselves, which is what socialism is always doing. And so even if this is a condemnation of greed and a condemnation of the way that this particular individual is using his capital, this doesn't mean that it's an affirmation of a centrally planned socialist economy. That's not not in the text at all. And we'll see this. Jesus goes on here in starting in verse 22 in chapter 12 of Luke. He goes on to say, and he said to his disciples, "For this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor for your body as to what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom nor barn, and yet God feeds them. How much more valuable you are than the birds." And then he goes on and talks about this a little bit more. And then to round out this passage, he says, "For all these things the nations of the world eagerly seek, but your Father knows that you need these things. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Do not be afraid, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom." And then he goes on, "Sell your possessions and give the charity. Make yourself money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Again, this is all great teaching. And I think that every single Christian should be committed to radical charity, to giving up that which could be rightfully ours for the sake of people that are in need. All of this is great. None of this has to do with the government owning the means of production or with central economic planning. And in fact, again, in verse 33, you have a passage where Jesus says, "Sell your possessions and give to charity." Sell your possessions and give the charity, not have the government come and take the possessions of other people that you don't like and give it to people that you think are more deserving of it, right? So even there, just on the face of the text, we can understand that these texts are not directly related to the modern definitions, the modern anchored definitions, irreducible definitions of socialism and capitalism, because capitalism is not about greed or avarice or being evil. Capitalism is about the private property rights of capital owners and their ability to contractually and morally acquire capital and then utilize that in the way that they see fit. And socialism is the exact opposite, right? So this passage has really nothing to do with modern conceptions of capitalism or socialism. And as I'm going to demonstrate in future episodes this year, I truly believe that passages like this, especially in verse 33, ultimately lead to the idea that Christians as individuals have to be, and as a church, as a collective community, but then also as individuals, we have to be responsible with the resources that God has given us. And it's up to us to make the sacrifices on our own, not impose these sacrifices on other people using the power of the government, which is what socialism always does. So that's my concern. And I really wanted to make sure that I fleshed that out in this text. All right. So far, we're doing good in my first full-length video episode. I'm going to take a little break and have a drink of water here. I also apologize for the people that are listening to this exclusively on the RSS feed. My drink of water would be something that I would edit out of a solo episode, but here we are. That's okay. We're having a very good time here. So I wanted to give you that example because I wanted to actually have something tangible from the Bible that we could think through today. And I just wanted to demonstrate how once you think about the way that these economic terms are actually employed, and that in reality, it's about the allocation of capital, and that within like the Austrian school of economics, there is no capitalism without the fundamental respect for property rights, which means that capital owners also have to respect the property rights of other people, then this all starts to fall into place and make a lot of sense. And it turns out that Jesus isn't critiquing late stage capitalism or whatever the leftist biblical scholars say. And in reality, Jesus is just talking about the responsibility that those that follow him and that those that are participating in his kingdom have towards other people, which, I can't say it enough. If you take the nonviolence of Jesus seriously, the idea that we would give one group of people with guns the power to take at will from another group of people to distribute to a third group of people, which is what socialism inevitably winds up doing, doesn't seem like that's something that Jesus would want. Okay, so a couple of biblical scholars here that I would like to discuss today. Let me take a look at my notes real quick to make sure I address these in the right one. Okay, so the first book that I want to show you is a book called The Political Aims of Jesus by a scholar named Douglas Oakman. And this is a great example of what I was just talking about. He's obviously, as we're going to see in a minute, a leftist, but he does some really excellent historical analysis on how the economies worked in ancient Judea and Galilee. So these are peasant agrarian societies. And I mean, the majority of the scholarship in this book is phenomenal. But he has a section at the end of the book where he talks about some of the theological conclusions that he drew from his research. And I want to read just a very small passage. This is from page 136 in his book, which I never when I'm doing these episodes, I never put bookmarks in these books beforehand. Oh, this one actually had the tab there. I almost never put bookmarks in here, so I'm always trying to flip through. So here we go. You guys get to watch me read on camera. This is fun. Okay. So here's what he says at the end, is he's trying to draw some conclusions about how we could apply his reading of Jesus to modern politics. He says, and this book was written in 2012, right? I think 2012 or 2013. So this is written at the height of the Obama administration and the height of the war on terror. And here's what he says: in a politically grim time at the beginning of the 21st century, new nationalisms and ethnic wars have arisen to presage an inhumane political future. Religious legitimation of these conflicts has been proffered under the terms crusade and jihad, in place of meaningful commitment to international dialogue or international laws. There is an enormous black market in weapons and nationalistic weapons research that proceeds apace. Under the conditions of global capitalism, capital gravitates towards the hyper-rich who now, at least in the United States, can buy elections and substantiate the claim that we seem to have a government of the wealthy, by the wealthy, and for the wealthy. Now, anyone who is operating with an Austrian definition of capitalism, an actual definition of capitalism based on capital acquisition through original appropriation or contractual exchange, which is how Hans Hermann Hoppe, I think, very helpfully defines this, will understand that if global capital is being accumulated by a small minority of super wealthy people that are also using the power of government to, I guess, defend their control or solidify or consolidate their control over capital, that's not actual capitalism. And this isn't one of those excuses like where people look at the Soviet Union and say, well, that wasn't real communism, or that wasn't real socialism. Capitalism, first and foremost, is about the rights of individual people to acquire capital morally and then dispense of that capital as they see fit. The moment that people that have acquired capital go looking to government assistance to help them conserve and consolidate and preserve that capital, they're not actually capitalists anymore. In fact, they're socialists because they want to centrally control the factors of production. That is literally what socialism is. And so this is a great example of Oakman attributing to capitalism what is actually a result of socialism. Now, again, Hans Hermann Hoppe has this really great article that I'm going to deal with on a subsequent episode called like Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis, where he talks about how people that are influenced by the Marxist tradition actually share a lot of the same concerns as us Austrians. And I think he's completely right. Like the idea that there is a super rich slate of extremely wealthy people sitting on top of the global economy is a correct observation. But it's not because these people respect the natural rights of the citizens of the world and want to allow people to accumulate capital on their own and make decisions about how that capital is utilized. It's because they want to control all the resources for their power and their prestige, which is exactly what happens under socialism. He's literally describing socialism in that passage, but because we have been trained to think of capitalism as being about greed and evil and avarice and all of these other things, we just automatically assume that when we see all of these resources being concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, that it's automatically capitalism's fault, when in reality, these people are using the force of the law to violate the natural rights of literally millions of people. But that's all that the government is. I mean, I'm a Rothbardian as well, and Rothbard is right. The state is just simply the organization in society that has a monopoly on physical force and that generates revenue through coercion, which is exactly more of what the socialists want. They want the government to be involved in the economy. They want the government to control and regulate capital. And for Peter Oakman, this is what's already happening. Like, he's describing the world that we're living in right now, and socialism ain't going to solve it, and capitalism isn't the problem. So there's that. I want to do a whole episode. I do the Ludwig von Mises versus Christian Scholar series. I kind of like the camera now. This is fun. I'm going to do a whole episode on this book, and then I'm going to do a whole episode on this book, or at least on Richard Horsley, because I think he does have a lot of great scholarship. I'm going to hold it up to the camera here in the lights. So this one's called Jesus and Empire. And Richard Horsley was a big proponent of the anti-imperial reading of Paul. And although I have developed and nuanced my opinions and perspectives on whether or not Paul was anti-imperial. I still think a lot of his work is really excellent and helpful, especially as it relates to understanding the dynamics of politics and economics in the first century. And Horsley is very much like Oakman in the same position of being someone who has done very good and very careful research. And his research I've used, and it's been very helpful in a lot of ways on my show. He does a really great job of doing this. But he just doesn't draw the right conclusions. And there are plenty of times in the introduction to Horsley's book and in the epilogue to Horsley's book, and I'm going to read from the epilogue, where he talks about the problems of global capitalism in the same way that Oakman does, that he believes that capitalism is the current state of political affairs around the world is the result of unregulated, uncontrolled, free market capitalism, which we've already seen. And if you're listening to the show, you probably intuitively understand that it's not. Now, he gives a really interesting analysis in the end of this book about how the United States became the sole imperial superpower around the world. And he will connect this in an earlier part of the book. And I guess as he develops his epilogue, he'll bring this idea back in later. I don't think he uses the term capitalism here, but he's going to associate this with the economic system that he calls capitalism, which he never actually defines in this book. And he certainly doesn't have a definition of capitalism that corresponds to what I think capitalism actually is, which is, again, just the private ownership of capital. So he's talking about how the United States became this grand empire. And here's what he says. He says it was Theodore Roosevelt who really set the tone and dictated the terms of the American empire that would be fully realized in the Pax Americana at the turn of the new millennium. He thought that the vigorous young American nation was on its way to becoming the new Rome, the final incarnation in the movement of imperial civilization. Like his social Darwinist contemporaries and the patrician architects of the ancient Roman Empire who placed tyrants like Herod the Great in power, he understood that it was possible to move peoples from barbarism to civilization only through the intermediate stage of despotism. For Christian Western civilization to carry out its historic destiny of the domination of an unruly world, therefore required a certain amount of brutality. The irony here, again, read Hayek, go back and listen to the episode I did on the counter-revolution of science. The entire idea of central planning is that there is an unruly world out there that needs to be controlled by technocrats. And if there are people that have to be subjugated or killed or stripped of their rights in the process of creating this grand utopia, then so be it. And Richard Horsley is the heir of that intellectual tradition. In fact, he's defending that very intellectual tradition in this book, because with socialism comes the idea that you have to suppress the rights of you have to suppress the natural. There it is. You have to suppress the natural rights of peaceful people. And socialism is ultimately about dominating an unruly world. That's the idea, about bringing order into perceived chaos. That's the point. So you can already see the irony here. What's really funny is he goes on, one must harass and smash the insurgents in every way until they are literally beaten into pieces, which I guess is a quotation from Theodore Roosevelt there. As president, he practiced what he preached. In his 1904 corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, he transformed in one stroke what had been a warning to keep European powers out of Latin America into an assertion of the United States intervention with an exercise of an international police power against any lapse from civilized behavior in the hemisphere. Roosevelt had thus set the policy and tone in which the U.S. government, often through the CIA, acted later in the century to overthrow elected governments in other countries, for example, in Guatemala and Iran under Eisenhower, and in Chile under Nixon, and to wage war, Desert Storm against Iraq under George H.W. Bush, and as this book goes to press, possibly again under George W. Bush. This book was published in 2003, so he was ultimately right about that. And as good libertarians, we can see, I mean, he's not wrong, right? Like Richard Horsley's making correct observations about the way that power is dispensed in the world. It's just the fact that he connects these developments and American imperialism in general with capitalism is a false understanding of how capitalism works, and is actually a result of the government gaining more and more power, including more and more power over the economy, because the only way that a state or a government can generate revenue is through coercion. You have to at some point take something from someone, even if they are not willing to give it up, and you have to do that through force. You can also tell that Horsley here is making a major, how do I phrase this the right way? What Horsley is doing here shows his obvious political biases. Because if you noticed, he talks about the growth of American imperialism under a handful of Republican presidents. He talks about Eisenhower, he talks about Nixon, and he talks about George H.W. Bush. And rightfully so, these conservatives were not great on war, to say the least. I guess you can give Nixon some credit for getting us out of Vietnam, but even then, it took him a while to do it. So none of these people are great. And ultimately, he was prophetic about George W. Bush. George W. Bush had a huge hand in launching the modern iteration of the war on terror. So he's right. But notice who he omits from his list of American imperialists. The two greatest American imperialists of the 20th century were Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson got us involved completely unnecessarily in World War I. And a lot of it, I think, had to do with the fact that American bankers, now under the direction of the Federal Reserve, floated a bunch of loans to England and France. And when they realized that a truce might be called and England and France wouldn't pay back those loans, they wanted to make sure that they could go over there and get their money. And you better believe that a lot of those people were good friends with Woodrow Wilson. So how's that for socialism? Woodrow Wilson's the absolute worst imperialist of the 21st century, and in a lot of ways set the stage for the dysfunction that we're currently experiencing around the world right there. And Richard Horsley won't even acknowledge that, because Richard Horsley is so committed to his left-wing political ideology that he's willing to ignore the crimes that are committed by his own team. Right. So Woodrow Wilson is a massive omission, and he wouldn't consider Woodrow Wilson to be a capitalist. And he'd be right, because Woodrow Wilson wasn't. The problem is that the policies of Eisenhower and Nixon and both Bushes are no different. They're just an expanded version of Wilsonian socialism and imperialism. And then FDR, I would say, too, and FDR, 4-term president. He ran and won in the elections. The author of the New Deal. He is kind of the architect of politicians using welfare programs to buy votes. Amity Shlaes has a great chapter in this in her book on the Great Depression, where she talks about the 1936 election and how it wasn't going well for FDR. And he just came out and said, I'm going to have New Deal programs that are targeted towards my constituents that I need to vote for me in order to win this election. And he won, and politicians have followed the same playbook ever since. And he got us involved in World War II. And then Democrat Harry Truman dropped the atomic bomb, starting the nuclear age, even though all of his generals, including Eisenhower, said it was a terrible idea and he shouldn't have done it. LBJ was a giant socialist that got us involved in Vietnam. Barack Obama, obviously, you can't blame Horsley for that, because Barack Obama was 5 years after this book was written. But Barack Obama continued on all of George H.W. Bush's terrible and atrocious policies in the war on terror. And so the growth of American imperialism is a bipartisan phenomenon. And the reason why it's a bipartisan phenomenon is that both major parties in the United States operate under a set of statist assumptions. They're all implicitly socialist, because they all believe that, at least to a certain degree, the government has to have a hand in controlling and regulating the economy. And in fact, if they don't, the government loses its only source of revenue. Right? Like, if the government is not involved, and I mean, because even then, taxation is a form of regulation. If under pure capitalism, people have to acquire capital on their own, and the only method of producing more goods and more services is through private capital acquisition, well, when government comes in and takes away a portion of your income, that's income that individuals could have used for building their capital, for growing their capital, and the government just takes that away and invests it in the interest of the politicians, always under the guise of either keeping us safe or helping people that are in need. Now, it seems like all of these socialist programs and the welfare state and all of it have absolutely failed. We have a permanent underclass in the United States, and we've been at war for longer than I've been alive. But these left-wing biblical scholars just refuse to think about the consequences of these policies, because they're obviously being ideologically driven by their political convictions. Now, again, this sounds really harsh. Okay, but I really respect and appreciate the work of both of these scholars, and I'm going to be heavily utilizing a lot of their historical research and the work that I'm going to be doing in 2025. I just wanted to point out the inconsistencies in the way that they conceptualize terms like capitalism and socialism, and show that all of the problems that they attribute to capitalism are actually the result of socialism. I also forgot in my list of U.S. presidents that are responsible for our current global dysfunction, Jimmy Carter deserves a lot of blame for this. I know that that people love him because of Habitat for Humanity, and he's a nice Southern Baptist, and he was a great guy. But his administration is responsible for the Carter Doctrine, which turned the Persian Gulf into an American lake. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the war between Iraq and Iran and the Iranian Revolution, all of this took place at the same time. He was worried about the increasing influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And so his administration essentially declared that we were going to have a permanent military presence in on the Arabian Peninsula, and that this was going to be a non-negotiable for American politics. And we have literally been at war in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf ever since. All completely unnecessary. And a lot of it, and Richard Horsley would correctly make this point, a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are a lot of American companies, especially defense companies, that have a vested economic interest in lower oil prices. And we want to make sure that we control the flow of oil. That's great. But if the government controls the flow of oil, it's not capitalism. It is not the private ownership and utilization of capital. It is socialism, plain and clear. That's exactly what it is. And so all of these political and economic problems that these left-wing scholars are complaining about are a result of policies that they support. They want more of this. And I just think that when we step back and try to actually anchor these two definitions to something that is consistent and clear and irreducible, then we'll see that a lot of that language will shift. Now, there's actually probably a lot of overlap between Richard Horsley's political worldview and my worldview as a libertarian, because in a lot of ways, like, Marxists and Austrians have a lot of the same conceptual concerns. It's about the accumulation of power. It's about people that have arbitrary control over others being greedy and wanting more. Like, we're concerned about a lot of the same things, but we just use different language to describe it. And I think that once we can more adequately assess the economic component of this conversation and be very clear about how we apply these terms to the first century and about the kind of information that we're expecting these first century authors to give us, then we can actually have a lot more accurate interpretations, both of the material that deals with economics and politics in the Bible and how we apply this to our own modern situation. Okay, cool. Well, this is weird looking at myself in the on the screen here, and I look very preacher-like, I guess, when I go on rants like this. We're 45 minutes in. That is really the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. But I do have one announcement before I get out today, and it is that these issues have really been at the front and center of what has been driving my thinking about the Bible and about politics and about the church and about my responsibility as a Christian for the last several years. And I have been doing a lot over the last year of, reading and reviewing books that are sometimes directly related to libertarianism and economics, or sometimes they're not. But it's a lot of books on biblical studies that I think are incredibly important and that are at least tangentially related, even if they're not directly related to the show. I know that I did like 6 episodes on the next quest for the historical Jesus, but if we want to understand Jesus in his historical context and be able to answer scholars like Richard Horsley and Peter Oakman that are essentially arguing for the socialist interpretation of Jesus, then we have to have a solid methodological framework for doing that. And even like James Crossley is a Marxist biblical interpreter who has a lot of great research, again, on the first century. And I think he gets some of the economic components of that wrong, but I had him on the show. We have to understand methodology, which is why I've been doing all this Next Quest stuff. And going forward in 2025, I still plan on doing a lot of that reading and reviewing and doing author interviews, but I'm going to scale back a little bit because I'm working on a book. So my plan is that throughout 2025 and into 2026, I'm going to be working on a book that's dealing with exactly the issues that I am addressing on this show today. I want to explore passages in the New Testament that are often used in modern political and economic debates. And I want to try to reframe the way that we understand that. And I want to do it by kind of comprehensively analyzing how the terms capitalism and socialism are used, and then providing kind of a Rothbardian framework for thinking about the political spectrum. I think that conservatism and progressivism are both two sides of the same political spectrum. Like they're both socialists. Like the average conservative and the average progressive have more in common with each other than they do with hardcore anarcho-capitalist libertarians like me. And so I want to explore how, when we try to have a more nuanced and less reductionistic definition of these political concepts and of these very important economic terms, how that might help us better shape the way that we think about what the writers of the New Testament are actually trying to tell us and the political conclusions that we can draw from that. And so in this book, I'm going to be talking a lot about definitions. I want to talk a lot about methodology. How do we get information out of the Gospels? What does the Gospels tell us about Jesus and his historical context in agrarian Galilee and in Judea? What does the Apostle Paul, like how does Paul's thinking on issues like the church and salvation relate to his understanding of how Christians ought to be charitable? How does that relate to the Jesus tradition? There are a lot of methodological issues that are all tied up into these questions. And while I've met several biblical scholars that are libertarians or that are concerned and that have seen the same problems that I've been articulating on my show today in biblical scholarship, there are none out there that have tried to write a book like this before, where you synthesize the Austrian tradition and these irreducible definitions of economic terms, and then try to see how this works within the framework of like technical biblical interpretation. I understand that I'm not a professional biblical scholar, but my hope is that with this book, I will be able to, put together ideas that might not have been put together like this before. And in doing so, maybe spur people who are more intelligent and more research. Like I would hope that I could give this book, when it's all said and done, to a scholar who actually knows what they're talking about, and they could run with it and develop some of these ideas. I want to push the conversation forward, because I feel like a lot of these conversations are stale, and there are, like Gary North's a good example of like a Christian voice. LCI, we do a lot of good work on this, but I think that there's a nexus between the Austrian School of Economics and biblical scholarship that just hasn't been explored. And I'm not the right person to do that, but I feel compelled to. So my goal over the next year or so is to develop a manuscript, and hopefully by the spring of 2026, I'll have a book, and I'll shop around, and hopefully we can get it published and people can get out there and read it. And so one of the things and it's going to require a lot of research. So my hope is that over the next couple of years, over the next couple of months, really over the course of this year, that as I'm doing this research and trying to piece all of these ideas together, I want to be able to take some of this information that I'm working on and do more solo episodes on the podcast. And sometimes, there are going to be issues that I'll deal with in the book tangentially that I can do a deep dive. Like my podcast will be an extended footnote on these issues that are really important. So I plan on doing a lot of more solo episodes this year and really kind of getting back to my roots of exploring the relationship between these ideas. And so in order to do the research to write this book, I'm not going to be able to take on as many book reviews as I did before. Still going to do some. I still think it's really important. And whenever I do get this book written, hopefully it's within a year, I'll be able to go back to doing book reviews on more of a full-time basis, because I love that part of this job. It's really fun, but it does make it difficult to do research. So all that aside, guys, 51 minutes long. Thank you all so much for either listening on the RSS feed or watching me rant in a room by myself. I appreciate you guys on both YouTube and on the RSS feeds, listening to the show. As always, thank you for what you guys do. I couldn't do any of this without you. And I hope that if you like what we're doing, please subscribe to the show on as many podcast platforms as possible. Go to YouTube at Pro Liberty Pod and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Even if you don't, I don't watch podcasts on YouTube. I watch YouTube on lunch, and it's mostly videos about how to work out better. That's like kind of what I use YouTube for more than anything else. But even if you don't use YouTube, please get on there and support me so that you can boost me up in the algorithm. Follow me on Twitter at Pro Liberty Pod, and you can support us at the Libertarian Christian Institute, libertarianchristians.com. And then you can buy all of our merch, libertarianchristians.com/shop/store. Either work because of a mistake that I made on a live stream one time. So thank you guys for everything that you do. I really appreciate you guys listening to the show, and I will see you all next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.